right. Hi, I'm Milica, back with you today talking about academic podcast entanglements. So I'm here today with Chelsea Miya. She's a postdoctorate fellow at McMaster University's Sherman Centre for Digital Scholarship. I'm pleased that you could join me today, and our theme for this episode is radio voice prints. So please tell us more about yourself and your voice print.
Thank you for that lovely introduction. As you said, I'm a postdoc at the Sherman Centre. Before that, I was a postdoc and did my doctorate at University of Alberta, where I was really closely involved and am still involved with the SpokenWeb Network, which is a multi-institutional network of sound studies artists, researchers, archivists, librarians that spans many institutes across North America, including University of Alberta. So while I was there, I got really interested in archives, specifically archives of campus radio. But we kind of happened or stumbled upon this archive in a unexpected way, and as a result of the work that I was doing with Spoken Web Alberta on digitizing these archives, it sort of led us down this pathway of investigating the history of campus radio at University of Alberta, but also more widely across Canada, the different really interesting things that were happening at campus stations in the late 70s, early 80s is really fascinating and something that I'm excited to talk about today.
Thank you so much. Yeah, you've explained a little bit about spoken web and what it's about. What does it entail though? So what does the project unbox exactly?
The research group at University of Alberta, I believe, I hope I'm telling the story the right way, but what I think happened was there were these cardboard boxes of media, reel-to-reel tapes, and I think magnetic tapes, magnetic tape reels that were being thrown out by the English department. So there were these boxes that had been slated to be picked up and taken, I think, probably to the dump. And then Cecily, who's one of the professors in the English department, really luckily stepped forward and saved the boxes from being taken to the dump, and decided to actually listen to the tapes and figure out what was on them. And after listening to the reels, we realized that they were recordings of poets and sound artists and authors, basically a who's who of Canadian literary canon at the time, who had come to the University of Alberta and given these readings and done these Q&As. And until these tapes had been rediscovered, a lot of these recordings had not been heard in decades. So it was really it was really an amazing find. So since then, we've acquired new material, other types of material, and in addition to these literary, what they were is they were kind of invited authors who would come and give a performance and do a Q&A after. But we started to find like other types of recordings that were a little bit harder to classify. Things like campus lectures. So they would come into a classroom and lectures with the students, and those are really interesting because you would sometimes get really unexpected reactions from the students who would be pushing back against the ideas of these authors, or asking really provocative questions. So those were great. We also had recordings from different radio shows. And those were that was the collection that I was kind of tasked to help digitize. This is when I was a research assistant as a graduate student. So myself and my colleagues Ariel and Nick, we were working on digitizing these radio collections, and we knew that they had been acquired by University of Alberta Archives in collaboration with CKUA, which was a community radio station, or is a community radio station in Edmonton, one of the oldest community radio stations. I think it even predates CBC, so all the way back to the 1910s. And they were doing a lot of work with the University of Alberta back in the 60s and 70s and 80s to produce these educational shows. So anyway, we had these interesting fawns, but we weren't really sure what we were listening to, what was on the tape. And sometimes we would get recordings where we knew who we were listening to, but other times they were unmarked, or we had to do some sort of careful detective work to figure out whose voices were on the tapes. But in the case of the radio show, we were really captivated by this really fantastic and weird artsy experimental show that had all of this really great like synth music and all these like weird guests that were from different departments at the university, and then also these like literary guests who would come on and talk about their work. And we were really intrigued by this mystery host whose voice that we heard and became really familiar with, because we spent hours and hours like listening to these tapes and digitizing them and then transcribing them or time stamping them. So it was a lot of close listening to this forgotten radio show. But we had to figure out we wanted to figure out whose voices they were. We did some research into the tapes, found out that they were produced by Yoris Balan, who was back at the time in the late 70s, early 80s, also a graduate student in the English department. So after figuring out who it was, we tracked him down, did some interviews with him, and found out more about this really wonderful radio show and about this history of student produced work. And they were really like, I don't know, I found it so charming and endearing that it was these really fantastic interviews and performances that we're listening to had been sort of the brainchild of this graduate student who was really passionate about literature and sound and radio. And hearing his story, we were, I think, identified it with him as graduate students in the English and Film Studies department. And it inspired us to do our first podcast episode, which was kind of a meta expose on the discovery of this campus radio show. And from there, we started looking deeper into the history of campus radio in Canada, and the really amazing contributions that students have been making to radio and to literary history and performance in Canada.
Yeah, I found it fascinating, especially like I've been listening to a couple of the SpokenWeb episodes, and they're all very different. And I guess it just depends what you unbox, right? It's a surprise. It's like a mystery box. And it kind of relates to the YouTube unboxing, because they're unboxing little treats. You're unboxing sounds. It's fascinating. I love it. And I like how you mentioned close listening. So instead of close reading, you're close listening. So that is a practice that is being done as well. And it's a performance. So it's the way that we perform our experiences. So in our last conversation, you directed me to a specific episode, season 3, episode 8. Here, the campus radio show tape recordings were from the 1980s, and they were being unboxed. So it was the radio talks and lectures that were being broadcasted. So the broadcasts were being translated as educational public scholarship. And this practice validated the audio and teaching pedagogy experimentation being done at the University of Alberta, using radio as experimental alternative for community engagement, political discussions. The professors and students were connecting with the public meaningfully and pushing back against the institutional norms. So there was like some really good conversation happening there, showing us that campus radio culture was being integrated as a form of scholarship. So can you tell us more about your findings and how these relate to today's academic podcasting as form of public scholarship?
Yeah. Well, I think there's something about the voice that is so intimate, and that connects us. When we were archiving these campus radio shows. It was during COVID, so we were
Mhm.
working on our own in isolation, and a lot of graduate work can be very isolating.
Yeah.
um, we're kind of in our silo doing our research work alone. But what I loved about the archival work with spoken web, and what I love about podcasting in particular, is that it's so much a collaborative practice. Nick and I have recently produced another podcast together. It was such a great opportunity because Nick's also a performer, a musician, so his background and strengths are in music and sound design and production. I have a background in journalism, so I could draw upon some of those practices in editing and scripting. And Ariel is just like an absolutely fantastic and knowledgeable scholar and researcher and writer in her own right. So the three of us coming together were really able to create something special. Or sometimes digital humanities work can be kind of less intellectual and more laborious in terms of actually like digitizing and like listening and typing in the timestamps and marking it up and then uploading. So it's less intellectual work and more labor, which is and it's important labor, but
Yeah.
we have less I don't know, less room to be creative and to do something with the material. But with podcasting, you can actually to do something, and it's a form, I think, of research creation, of close listening to the archive, but of also talking back to it, responding to it, remaking it. I think for new audiences. So that's what we were hoping to do. We became fans of the show through archiving and listening to it. But in making the podcast, we hope that we were able to make other fans of the show and also get people thinking about this longer history in different ways. At the same time as it's been this, at the same time as there is this long history, it's also changed in a lot of ways. Yars and Terry and the group of students who were making this work were recording these interviews on reel-to-reel cassettes, so taking them out into the field, and they were cutting them by hand, which was really incredible when you think about it. And I believe they were producing like one episode every other week or something at its height, which is it's a lot. And he is also, a graduate student at the time. He described it as being like something he absolutely loved doing. Like you could be TAing or teaching or like making this cool show. So he just sort of jumped at the chance to be able to produce a podcast. But it was a lot of sort of hands-on work, and I think it still is a lot is a lot of hands-on DIY working with technology. The episode that I made last week with Nick was our first live podcast that we've ever produced, and when we pitched the idea to the SpokenWeb symposium team, we were like, yeah, of course this will work, live podcast, it'll be easy. And then when it actually came down to it, it was it was a lot. Our technical setup was intense. We had like multiple mixing boards and 2 laptops, and we were doing the voiceover live, but being there with the live audience was like so energizing and exciting. But that was like sort of a reminder of like, this is the hands-on work of like actually making something and taking sound and interview footage and interview recordings and doing something with it, and hearing people respond to that and connect with it was really, really exciting. So it's in some ways it's lost a bit of that DIY aspect to it. We do all of our editing on using software like Audacity or Hindenburg or Adobe or whatever. So it's not as labor intensive, but it also is. You're still working with tracks and moving them around and engaging with sound and such in a really different way. And I think as podcast creators, we have to like you really think about and listen carefully, because you have to. You're listening for those like ums and ahs like I'm doing right now that you want to cut
Yes.
out. You're listening for like the good sound clips, and you listen and re-listen again and again in order to like get those like cuts right and to put it together. So you really engage with listening in a very like intimate and practical way. But our relationship to like place and to our guests and how we interview them is really different. Yars and Terry sort of describe going or interviewing, bringing their guests in studio, which was, I think, in the biology lab or underneath the biology lab, as they describe. So there's this really great moment in the podcast episode about it we did where they talk about going into sort of the bowels of underneath the biology department, which was where their recording studio was, and bringing people like Margaret Atwood and Stephen Scobie down there and them being like, what, where are you taking me? Um, but when you have to do it in person like that, it's a different experience and a different relationship to your guests than doing it on Zoom. And I think a lot of podcasters now do their interviews over Zoom, or I have been doing that because it's, convenient, and video conferencing is really great. But you also lose some of that intimacy of being in person and of relating to space and place in a different way than we do now, when it's a bit more dislocated.
I agree. Yeah, I see the differences and similarities. So we are still moving the tracks around. We are still definitely making the audio into something different, remaking, I guess, the sound. And we're experimenting, but in different spaces. We're more digitalized right now, I believe. I've been doing most of my interviews on Zoom as well for this podcast series, only because of accessibility. It's transnational, so it just makes more sense for me to do it via Zoom. And even within the city, I feel like Zoom or Teams is the way to go. And these platforms become part of our space, part of our community, and part of our culture. It's like a contemporary podcasting space. So accessibility is one major driver, I feel, in our contemporary space. And yes, we do lose intimacy, but then we are creating new intimacies as well by closely listening, by looking at different affordances that this digital space is providing for us, right? And we're mobilizing knowledge together. So we are still co-creating, we're all still having that conversation, that dialogue, which brings into the critical podcasting methodology. I feel like the radio broadcasting, academic podcasting is similar. We are doing interviews, we're using voices, we're preserving our culture and challenging hierarchies. So we're having those difficult conversations as well via podcast. This practice is not new, so it's just being revolutionized or digitized to suit our social needs and constructs. We're pushing boundaries, perhaps pushing the medium. So how do you see academic podcasting communities using podcasts as this multimodal system, like within context of social and cultural realities?
Well, it's interesting that the practice of telling stories through sound is not new in scholarship and in academia. And radio itself is it's an old medium. And it's interesting that even today, with all of our technology and devices, we still are drawn to radio and to voice. And I think, especially during COVID, there was this resurgence of listenership and of interest in podcasts and podcasting. And I know through my own research and making a podcast, it was a really important way of staying connected, engaged with the world through podcasting and through radio. And I think there's something really special about the medium of radio and podcasting, because I think that we're almost being overwhelmed by media, and especially visual media. It can get really overstimulating. And whereas video, platforms like TikTok or Instagram, they kind of demand your attention in a really different way. You can sit there and, and scroll and scroll and scroll, and you're sort of focused, right? Like when people are on these platforms, they tend to be sort of staring at the screen and not aware of anything else. With podcasts, it's different because sound you can integrate with your environment. A lot of people listen as they do other things, as they do chores or go for a run or on their drive. So we're almost inviting these voices and experiences like into our space with us and into our experiences with us, which makes it a very versatile medium. And as I said, a very intimate medium. I think we've seen podcasts and sound mediums sort of make a bit of a comeback because I think we crave that release from our attention where we can kind of listen. We can listen closely, but also like passively if we want, as we do other things. Which is why it's really great in terms of scholarly podcasting in particular and why it's interesting and important. I think from a cynical perspective, you could say that it's part of this trend of almost extracting like more content and more stuff from us as researchers. Like, yes, here's another thing, another research output. So in that way, it's like maybe it's just part of the neoliberal machine of of finding new ways to extract labor from researchers. The optimist in me, and the part of me who really loves podcasting, would say that it's inviting in new types of researchers and new types of research. Scholarly journals for a long time were the pinnacle of of research. Like that is the measure of research, is getting those lines in your CV, the book chapter or the journal article, and it still like very is much that. But I think we're starting to realize that how important it is to learn how to tell our stories through different mediums and how to reach out to and engage with the public and speak to a public and not just be very insular and speaking to like fellow experts and academics. That type of scholarship is important, of course, but it's also really important to understand like why we're doing this type of research, why we're doing this research at all, and to help the public and help ourselves like make sense of it and make meaning of it. I think telling our stories through a public engaged medium like podcasting asks us to reflect on and think about our research in really different ways. You might interview different guests and invite in different perspectives, and when you're doing a podcast as opposed to doing a journal article, to completely rethink how you do research. I teach podcasting workshops to graduate students and researchers and staff at McMaster and do consultations. And some of what I teach is learning how to ask questions in a different kind of way, and learning how to tell stories in a very different way. Because when you write an article, you're not usually thinking about things like character and setting and charting like a story arc, or thinking about climax and tension. And you have to think about those things when you're storyboarding your podcast and trying to figure out like what is interesting, what is going to be interesting and engaging to listeners. So when you have to think about your research in that way, it can invite in new perspectives, I think. And also it helps you become a better asker of questions, I think. If you go to conferences, sometimes you hear researchers ask questions at the end of a presentation, and sometimes they're good questions, and other times it's more of a performative intellectualism, in that you're making a point, or you're listening to them talk and you're like, is there really a question there? I don't know. Whereas as a podcaster and as a journalist, you're sort of thinking about questions in a really different way. You're trying to open up the conversation, invite in and engage your guest, and you're listening to your guests and trying to hone in on their cues that they're giving you about like what they're excited about, what they're interested in. So it asks you to be like a really active and engaged listener in the sense of like being an interviewer, I think, in a different way. And there are all sorts of ways that this can help you in your scholarship. I find like having had a bit of experience in journalism before and coming back to it through podcasting, it's served me in so many ways, becoming a better instructor, a better listener
Mhm.
in the classroom to my students, better able to sort of engage with them and invite them into conversations and a better facilitator, whether it's like chairing a panel or
Mhm.
um, hosting a guest speaker or a keynote or something like that. It's teaching you these skills of how to be attuned and attentive and present, which is really important. 'Cause, again, like as researchers, we can sometimes retreat into ourselves, into our bubble of intellectualism, and forget about what it is to like exist with other people.
Thank you. That was very insightful. Yeah, I feel the same way. I feel like it's important to have that critical dialogue. It's really important to talk to people about the research that's being done. It just opens up another perspective or a counter perspective to what you revealed in your findings, I guess, or in your readings. But then you have that conversation and it provides that extended space for that thread. In my personal, I guess, opinion. I like it because I get to talk to, or I try to talk to, the scholars that are writing the research I'm researching on. So it's like, oh, I'm going to contact this person and talk about their article they wrote, or I'm going to contact you, Chelsea, because I'm so interested in radio broadcasting and the cultural transitions onto podcasting. So why not have that conversation instead of just having that, I guess, my little bubble around me and just writing back and forth. I feel like it's important to open up the space a little bit more.
Yeah, I should also say too, like there are other ways to do this outside of podcasting too. I find like there's a really interesting. I was kind of like ragging on like TikTok earlier, but I find like some really fantastic and important conversations, political conversations are happening like on these platforms in like really creative, interesting ways. And I'm also interested in like how platforms change the type of conversations and the type of research that we can do. Podcasting it has opens up like very specific and interesting approaches, and at the same time, if you look at something like TikTok, like the structure of the medium, the features like duetting open up these really different avenues of rhetoric and of conversation and engagement that are really unique and specific to that medium.
Yeah, that connects with knowledge mobilization methods. Like you just tailor it to your audience. So depending on what your research is about and who your audience is for, TikTok would be great for a certain age group or a certain community that's interested in, I don't know, something political. But yeah, for sure, you'll reach a specific audience, a target audience, which is helpful.
Yeah, I think what these different platforms have allowed to is the public to talk back to us in new ways where they couldn't before, right? Which is really good and important. But I've seen some like really fantastic academics on platforms like TikTok who are doing like just cool cool things and inviting people to, you know, like duet with them to talk back to them and think through the ideas that they're putting out there in new ways.
Yeah, that's important. All right, so addressing the blurred lines, talking about voice and ownership. Who has ownership of voice?
That's a very very big question. Who has ownership of the voice? Well, I think one of the changes in terms of campus radio in the past versus scholarly podcasting now is that there's a lot more scrutiny over. Oh, well, I shouldn't say that. The female voice in particular has always been scrutinized throughout history, which is what I learned. Like back, you know, back in the the 70s and 80s when women were first breaking into broadcast, and you were getting women women's voices, women being seen and heard on public and private commercial radio in Canada for the first time. There was a lot of pushback and a lot of criticism of women's voices, and you know, fellow journalists, writing about how they couldn't stand to hear women on air because it was like very it was grating to their ears, or they found it like off-putting or whatever. And even today in the past decade, Stacey Copeland has written really, or she's done really amazing journalism and podcasting work about women's voices and about our sort of discomfort with with our own voices and the way that we sound. Um, a female vocal fry is often a target of critique, and the reason we have vocal fry is because we're taught that deeper voices, masculine voices, are more authoritative and will be more respected. So we sort of unconsciously like lower our voice and get that. I can hear my own vocal fry right now. But I definitely feel that when I did my bachelor's in journalism, we cycled through like different mediums. So we did like semester of like print, and then one of radio, and one of like video. And I remember the radio semester being, it felt like a lot of nervousness and pressure about being on radio. And I did terrible that semester. That was my worst semester actually in journalism school, as my radio one, which is so funny because I love radio so much now. But I think a lot of that was this sort of discomfort and fear of my voice, and feeling that it was too high or not authoritative enough. And I think my professor even told me like you have a terrible voice for radio. And
That's
that
really
stuck with me. And I remember having like male peers, and they would have this like just wonderful, like rich stereotypical sort of broadcast radio voice, and being so envious of them and wishing that I had that. And I think now there are a lot more really great feminist podcasts and feminist scholarly podcasts out there who have talked sort of about this, and there's something really great and provocative and inspiring about hearing women's voices and female scholars' voices in these spaces, making a space for themselves, and hearing women in conversation. And I don't know, there's something more powerful about that than even like reading a scholarly journal, which can be really compelling and amazing. And I should also say, like I said women's voices, but what I really mean is
Hmm.
any kind of marginalized communities, like being able to make
Yeah.
a space for themselves on
Yeah.
air is really important and needed, and something that has been going on in campus radio for decades.
Yeah.
Back in the 70s and 80s, alternative community radio was like a really important space for marginalized communities, queer communities, feminist communities, to create spaces for themselves. And one of the things that Stacey Copeland points out is that one of the reasons they were able to do this is because radio back then was a very ephemeral medium. You could speak out into the void, as Yaris and Terry say, and not really know who was listening. And that sort of protects you in some ways from internet trolling, that has become more of a problem nowadays. There's another really great campus radio historian, Jennifer Waits, and
Mhm.
she travels to campus radio studios all over North America and has visited like hundreds of them. And she has this really amazing like photo collage museum of pictures of campus radio stations, and they're often like very very like quirky and endearing and such. But Jennifer herself was a campus radio DJ, host when she was in university, and she sort of describes like her radio show would air in the campus cafeteria, like at lunch or so, like just a random time, and people would just be walking through the cafeteria and would like sometimes tune in, sometimes not. But there's something like really freeing about not having that permanence and that scrutiny. Whereas I think today with podcasting, there's so many metrics for measuring for measuring podcast success and listenership, and you can get really caught up and focused on that. And also like it's great that you can get feedback and response from listeners, but sometimes like you don't necessarily want that or care about it. It's nice to be able to just sort of say what you feel in the moment, and not be worried about being a target of online vitriol. So I think that's one of the things that has changed.
Thinking about that episode that I was listening to, they were describing like seeing posters and sofas and weird cabinets and like
Yes.
pop culture posters in the radio station. And I'm like,
Yeah.
we're pretty boring here. Like, we're just on Zoom and I got nothing. I got absolutely nothing around me.
Yeah, and that's a symptom of being, of the Zoom, the video conferencing generation. We're just sort of amorphous, right? We can take our interviews and our conferences like wherever we go.
Yeah. And we're so conscious about the sound quality. You're like, she just had her radio station in the cafeteria and didn't care about the background noise, didn't care about anything that could spontaneously drop or like make a huge sound. And then there's us like patting the walls. Like...
Yeah, that's true. I do love imperfect audio sometimes, though.
Yeah.
So, sometimes it can be distracting, but other times it's part of the charm of doing like a DIY hands-on medium.
Yeah, it brings that authenticity. It brings the human back. It'll be nice to do one outside. It's just the wind. I'm like, oh, I don't know. But yeah, for sure. So the role in the students, professors, public, past to present. So do you see the shift? What's the shift with our conversation today? I feel like it's very similar. I feel there's all across the board, students, professors, and the public, we're all pushing boundaries. We're all trying to experiment with different types of platforms, like you said, TikTok, podcasts, video, whatever your medium may be for your audience.
I think the new and upcoming group of emerging scholars are pretty versatile, pretty creative, doing pretty exciting and interesting things. In part, I think because we have to be. Academia is precarious, and we live in sort of a precarious time where it's hard to imagine being a traditional scholar because that doesn't exist anymore. I think it's really hard to do that. I don't know, like traditional pathway of, graduate school and then maybe a postdoc, and then you land your tenure track position, and then you're set. Those dream tenure track positions are becoming less and less. And in general, we're living during a time of like such tremendous change and upheaval. And that was made more apparent during COVID. But I think in so many ways, it's we're living in unprecedented, to use the COVID term, unprecedented times. But unprecedented for graduate students and new scholars as well, in that we're facing sort of uncertain futures, and I think we've had to adapt and had to become versatile and experiment with and engage with these new mediums and new skills as a means of survival, which sounds very, very dire. But but I think I think it's become an important skill for us to be flexible and to be doing new and innovative types of scholarship, because we're kind of realizing that the old model is not going to work anymore. In order for higher education to remain relevant and important and meaningful, we have to figure out new ways of engaging with the public. As emerging scholars too, I think it's also like we're trying to build up these diverse skill sets so that we can switch into something else if we need to. Like in the sense of like, the rise of alt-ac is something that also came up like just before COVID, and alt-ac and quit lit and such was like very much in the conversation in the zeitgeist, I think, in terms of like new academics sort of trying to figure out like how do we make a space for ourselves in this world where it's becoming harder and harder to do to make a living as a traditional scholar. And I think people like Hannah McGregor were very much like of that that generation of new scholars who were pushing back against like, what does it mean to be a scholar? And we're saying like, it doesn't have to be the peer-reviewed journal article. It isn't the be-all and end-all. We can do other things. And I think for us to redefine ourselves and what scholarship is and what academia is going to be so important for the survival of ourselves, the next generation of becoming scholars, but also for higher education in general. There was so much pushback again, so much like anti-intellectualism and so much fear and sort of criticism of science and of research and of scientific methods that sort of came out around like COVID times. And I think one of the things that's made us reflect upon is that it's, you can research and scientific methods are so important and meaningful, but we have to figure out how to communicate that to the public and communicate what we're doing. Otherwise it's kind of lost, right?
Yeah, for sure. I feel like we have to be aware of vulnerabilities that higher ed possesses and how to go with it. Like if something happens, learn how to shift and move. And like you said, be flexible, adaptive, survive.
Yeah. And it's not just academics too. Like I think every like, we're in one of these periods of enormous change. So so I think, building these diverse skill sets and remaining like open to change and open to new ideas and new methods is important.
Yeah, for sure. So on that note, what are your hopes for academic podcast communities?
I think that the work around peer review podcast is important in getting podcasting recognized as a legitimate form of research. So that is really important. Another change that has happened is we've started to rethink not just like the peer-reviewed journal article, but I think the essay as being the pinnacle of like how we evaluate research in the humanities. So I think for myself, especially with OpenAI and other large language models, we've kind of had to rethink like what what are we doing? What are we teaching? What is important in terms of teaching students how to communicate. And I think as instructors also being more flexible and open to other types of assignments and other ways of evaluating, including like podcasts, is really great because not everyone was made to do a peer-reviewed journal article or to do an essay, right? Like it's a really specific and really weird skill actually to be able to sit down and to make an argument in this structured way, which we've sort of said that this is how we evaluate how well you know a topic and such. But that's not the only way, and it's actually not really conducive to lots of types of personalities or there's so many brilliant, amazing people who tell stories and express themselves and learn in really different ways. And integrating podcasts into the classroom can be one way of giving an opportunity to to shine and to be like, oh, this isn't the only thing. Essays can also be they're less motivating in some ways because you would do this essay and hand it into your prof, and that would be the only person who would ever see it. So it's kind of like it's again like a strange a strange a practice in some ways when you think about it. Whereas with other types of mediums like podcasting, if you're making a work that's going to be heard by your fellow peers and your classmates, and that's going to be like put out there into the world, it changes the way that you think about it, and you think like, oh, this is actually important. It's not just about the grade and it's not just going to be read by one person maybe will do a check or whatever, give you an A or not. It's actually going to be heard by other people. And so students feeling that they are like active knowledge producers is really important as well. Experimenting with other types of mediums is great. I don't want to I was thinking, I'm like, I wonder if essays are going to become strange. Like we'll look back at them and be like, what is an essay? Yeah, exactly. Because it is very, very odd in a lot of ways. But I think, you know, some students have trouble like being like, well, why am I doing this? Why is this important or meaningful?
Yeah, but I do see students, like we have a research and methods course, and they have an option. They can write for their final project. They can write an essay, like a standard paper. They can do a podcast, or they can do like an ArcGIS story map. This term, I had more students do essays. I was like, what? What is happening? I don't know if it's just because it's just like, oh yeah, we do this for every course. It's just easier for us to whip up an essay versus doing a creative project. And even in my MA cohort, we had option as well to do something creative for some of our final assignments. So I don't know, sometimes maybe it's just personal preference too. What they're more familiar and comfortable with, they'll do. So I don't know.
Yeah, I get that. And sometimes you're also just tired. It's like you're like, I don't want to be.
That too.
I can't be creative anymore. I just need to, you know.
Yeah.
Sometimes you just need to phone it in and then be able to check out. So I also totally get that.
To my signature question, what are your favorite podcasts you listen to?
Oh, well, I have to plug the SpokenWeb podcast, my own podcast. So please listen to that. Not my podcast, I should say that. It's a podcast that I produce episodes for, but it's hosted by Catherine McLeod and Hannah McGregor, who do like a wonderful job of hosting it. But that podcast I really like. I love CBC radio podcasts. So Front Burner is one that I listen to. It's a feature news story of the day kind of podcast. Radio Lab is one of my favorites. Spark is another great CBC podcast. They talk about technology and culture. So that one I also love. And oh gosh, Babbage from The Economist is also great. And Planet Money is another great one. Planet Money is fantastic.
I'll add those to my list. Thank you. I think we're good for time. I'm going to wrap things up. Thanks for contributing to the conversation about podcasting and campus radio culture. It really drew out the remix and remaking of audio scholarship, the importance of voice in space, and how it can transform meanings and help construct or deconstruct ways of doing research.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks for being a great host and for inviting me on the show.
Check out the show notes for Chelsea's podcast favorites, including the links to SpokenWeb. Next episode, we'll dive into Brandon Edwards-Schuth's CPM, Critical Podcast Methodology. Until next time, ciao for now.